Before we begin this story, I need to extend an invitation to you. If you enjoy true mysteries, disturbing stories, and cases that leave more questions than answers, subscribe to the channel now. Because what you're about to hear today isn't just a simple story. It's something that's been frozen in time, waiting to be discovered. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I like to know how far these stories are going. The house in Los Feliz remained motionless, as if time had decided to ignore it. On an ordinary California street, surrounded by well-kept residences and vibrant gardens, that building stood out from everything around it. There were no clear signs of extreme neglect, no rotten wood or broken windows, but there was something worse, a complete absence of life, as if silently everything there had been abruptly and definitively interrupted. On the morning of December 6, 1959, the neighborhood's routine was broken by an eerie silence emanating from the Perelson family home. Dr. Harold Perelson, known for his reserved demeanor and methodical behavior, had not left for work. No movement, no lights, no activity. To an outside observer, it was just another quiet morning. But inside that house, chaos had already taken hold hours earlier. Harold was no ordinary man beneath the surface. Despite his respected position as a cardiologist, he carried a growing pressure that no one around him seemed to fully perceive. Failed projects, financial difficulties, and increasingly profound emotional isolation were beginning to shape something unstable within him. His once disciplined mind now operated in silence, accumulating disconnected and dangerous thoughts. That morning, while the house slept, Harold rose with an unsettling calm. There had been no prior argument, no clear sign of an impending breakup. He walked to the bedroom where his wife, Lillian, slept. What happened next was swift, brutal, and without warning. A sharp blow broke the silence of the night, followed by a sequence of cold, calculated actions. There was no hesitation, there was no turning back. Meanwhile, in the next room, her teenage daughter, Judy, awoke to the strange sound echoing through the hallways. It wasn't an ordinary noise. It wasn't something that could be ignored. There was weight, impact, something visceral about that sound. Instinct made her get out of bed, still confused but already gripped by a growing sense of danger. As she opened the bedroom door, the hallway seemed longer than ever. The dim lighting cast distorted shadows on the walls, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Judy walked slowly, trying to understand what was happening, until she saw her father. He didn't seem the same. Her eyes were fixed but devoid of any recognizable emotion. In her hands, she held a heavy object still marked by what had just happened. For a brief moment, father and daughter stared at each other. No words were spoken, but in that silence, everything was already clear. Judy reacted instinctively. Her body moved before her mind could fully process the situation. She screamed, ran, tried to escape the rapidly unfolding, irreversible scenario. Harold moved forward, but not with the same speed. An internal rift was occurring, something that held him between action and hesitation. That short break was enough. Judy managed to escape, fleeing the house in despair, banging on neighbors' doors, trying to form words between sobs and irregular breathing. When she finally managed to explain, the police were called. But upon returning to the house, they found something even more disturbing. Harold was dead. No confrontation, no pursuit. Just a final decision, executed with the same coldness with which it all began. The house then became a scene frozen in time. Dishes were still on the table. Christmas presents remained wrapped. An open book rested on the armchair. It was as if life had been interrupted in the middle of a simple gesture and never resumed. Over the years, the house was not sold. It was not renovated. It was not inhabited. It remained exactly as it was that morning, untouched, immobile. Suspended in a moment that no one wanted to revisit. Neighbors reported a constant feeling of unease when passing by the place. There was no movement, But there was a presence, not something visible, but something perceptible, as if the house held more than just objects, as if it held echoes. Decades later, curious onlookers and researchers began to take an interest in the case, not just the crime itself, but what came after. Reports began to emerge, lights seen at night, sounds coming from inside, doors that seemed to move on their own. Nothing officially confirmed, nothing completely ruled out. The house in Los Feliz wasn't just an abandoned place, it was a breaking point where logic seemed to fail and questions remained unanswered. What really happened that night? What drove Harold to act that way? And even more unsettling, why had the house never been touched? Some believed it was simply neglect. Others, that there was something deeper, something that kept that house exactly as it was, as if any attempt at change might awaken something dormant. And perhaps, deep down, no one was willing to find out. In the years following the crime, the house in Los Feliz ceased to be merely an abandoned residence and came to occupy an almost symbolic space in the collective mind of the neighborhood. It wasn't just what had happened there, but the fact that nothing seemed to have followed its natural course afterward. In a city where properties were quickly resold, renovated, and occupied, that house remained a permanent interruption in the flow of daily life. The police conducted a meticulous investigation at the time. The scene found inside the residence showed no signs of prolonged struggle or significant resistance. Everything indicated that the events had unfolded quickly, almost surgically. The reports described a sequence of actions that suggested planning, albeit motivated by a deteriorated psychological state. The name Harold Perelson, previously associated with medicine, and the predictable routine of a respected professional, began to carry a different weight, something that mixed perplexity and discomfort. Harold's life, when analyzed in retrospect, revealed cracks that had previously gone unnoticed. His involvement in side projects, especially a medical invention that did not achieve the expected success, had generated significant financial pressure. Later documents indicated mounting debts and failed negotiations. This accumulation of frustrations did not manifest itself explicitly, but silently shaped his behavior. He became more distant, more introspective, like someone who no longer shared the same emotional rhythm as the people around him. Lillian, on the other hand, maintained an appearance of normalcy. Her routine revolved around the house, the children, and small social interactions with neighbors. There are no clear records of intense conflicts between the couple, which made everything even more difficult to understand. To an outside observer, it was a functional family, embedded in a typical American middle-class context of the 1950s. But this normalcy, over time, began to be reinterpreted as a surface, something that concealed deeper tensions. Judy, the surviving daughter, became a central figure in attempts to reconstruct the events. Her account was essential in establishing the sequence of events, but it also carried inevitable gaps. She described her father's gaze, the immediate feeling of unease, the realization that something was profoundly wrong even before understanding what had happened. After the incident, Judy was taken in by relatives and, over time, distanced herself completely from that chapter of her life. Her story followed a different path, far from the house, far from the direct memory of what she witnessed. Yet, her experience remained the only direct human link to that night. The neighbors, initially shocked, developed an ambiguous relationship with the place. During the day, the house was just another silent building, but at night, it took on another dimension. It wasn't uncommon for accounts to surface, not as categorical statements, but as persistent impressions. A light that seemed to briefly turn on in one of the rooms. A muffled sound, like footsteps or objects being moved. Nothing that could be proven, but enough to fuel a collective feeling of unease. Over the decades, the neighborhood evolved. New families arrived, houses were renovated, architectural styles were updated. The house, however, remained untouched. Documents indicated that the property had been acquired by a new owner shortly after the crime, but he never actually occupied it. There were no renovations, no attempts at adaptation. It was as if the purchase had been merely a formality with no real intention of use. This detail began to intrigue investigators and curious onlookers. Why would someone keep a property in that state for so long? Some hypotheses pointed to legal issues, disputes, or even disinterest. Others suggested something less tangible, a silent refusal to interact with a space that seemed to carry more than just its physical structure. In the 1970s, the first records emerged of people trying to enter the house without authorization. Not out of vandalism, but out of curiosity. Accounts describe preserved interiors, furniture covered in a thin layer of dust, personal belongings left exactly where they were. A calendar still marked the month of December 1959. Clothes remained in the closets. Books were opened to specific pages, as if someone had left for a moment and never returned. These descriptions reinforced the idea that the house was not merely an abandoned place, but an environment frozen in a specific moment, a fragment of the past that resisted time. For some, this increased the fascination. For others, it intensified the discomfort. The case also began to attract the attention of researchers interested in human behavior and extreme events. Harold's figure began to be analyzed from different perspectives: psychological, social, economic. No explanation, however, seemed sufficient on its own. There was always an element that escaped, something that didn't quite fit into any theory. With the advancement of technology and increased access to information, the case gained new visibility. Photographs of the house began to circulate, amateur videos emerged, and discussions spread across different media. Each new record seemed to add more layers to the narrative, but without offering definitive answers. The house in Los Feliz then ceased to be merely a geographical point. It became a symbol of something broader: the fragility of appearances, the complexity of human motivations, and the persistence of unanswered questions. And while the world around it continued to transform, it remained there, silent, intact, and increasingly laden with meaning. Over time, the Los Feliz house case ceased to be merely a filed police report and took on an almost investigative character for those who refused to accept silence as an answer. What was once treated as an isolated tragedy began to be revisited from new perspectives, bringing to light inconsistencies, neglected details, and questions that until then had never been asked in depth. In the 1980s, an independent journalist named Daniel Mercer decided to revisit the case. Unlike other curious individuals, he wasn't just seeking the impact of the story, but also an understanding of its gaps. By analyzing the original documents, he noticed something that had gone unnoticed for years. Certain financial records of Harold didn't match the period immediately preceding the crime. There were unusual bank transactions, amounts withdrawn without clear explanation, and correspondence indicating unfinished business deals. Daniel began to track down this information. What he found broadened the conflict in an unexpected way. Harold wasn't just facing common financial difficulties, he was involved in a project that promised to revolutionize a specific medical procedure, but which at the same time had attracted unconventional investors. Names that didn't frequently appear in public records, contracts with unusual clauses, and deadlines that suggested intense pressure for results. This new element completely transformed the interpretation of the case. The image of a man who succumbed solely to a psychological breakdown began to share space with the possibility of external factors influencing his actions. Daniel didn't jump to conclusions, but each discovery made the story denser and less linear. Meanwhile, interest in the house grew. Small groups began to gather nearby, especially at night, trying to observe any unusual signs. Some brought rudimentary equipment, others simply out of curiosity. It was in this context that more frequent reports of unusual experiences emerged. Metallic sounds coming from inside, as if objects were being moved. Doors that, according to some, seemed to change position between visits. Nothing definitively proven, but enough to create a growing tension around the place. Although aware of these movements, the police maintained a detached stance. For the authorities, it was a closed case. There was no official evidence to justify reopening it. Still, informal records indicated that patrol cars occasionally passed through the area after calls from residents reporting suspicious activity. On all occasions, nothing concrete was found. Daniel, for his part, decided to take it a step further. He gained access to the interior of the house through a contact who claimed to be connected to the legal owner of the property. Upon entering, he immediately realized that time had not only stopped, it had been preserved. The air was thick, heavy with decades of immobility. Every object seemed to occupy exactly the same place since 1959, as if any alteration were a violation of something implicit. During the inspection, Daniel found documents that were not in the official files. Among them were Harold's personal notes. They weren't complete diaries, but fragments, loose ideas, calculations, isolated words. Amid these records, some phrases stood out. References to deadlines, mentions of meetings that were never officially documented, and a constant repetition of terms related to pressure and urgency. These elements intensified the narrative conflict. If Harold was being pressured by external factors, to what extent were his actions solely the result of his own instability? And furthermore, who were these people involved behind the scenes of his projects? At the same time, Daniel began to notice something he hadn't expected. During his visits to the house, always at different times, he noticed small variations in the environment. An object that seemed slightly out of place. A door that wasn't exactly in the same position. Initially, he attributed it to a faulty memory. But the repetition of these details began to raise doubts. He began to record everything more precisely. Photographs, detailed notes, comparisons between visits. At a certain point, the visual evidence began to suggest that something was, in fact, changing, albeit subtly. It wasn't possible to pinpoint the cause, but the observation was enough to alter his perception of the space. The conflict then expanded in two directions. On one side, rational investigation, based on documents, records, and human connections. On the other, a direct experience that began to challenge that same logic. Daniel found himself torn between maintaining the objectivity of his work and dealing with the growing feeling that there was something in that environment that didn't fit into conventional explanations. This duality began to influence his decisions. He started returning to the house more frequently, even aware of the legal and personal risks. Each new visit brought small revelations, but also increased the tension. The space ceased to be merely a setting and began to act as an active element in the narrative. Meanwhile, people close to Daniel began to notice changes in his behavior. He became more introverted, less communicative, like someone absorbed by something he couldn't fully share. His investigation, which began as a journalistic project, was now taking on personal dimensions. The Feliz house case, once marked by an isolated event, now unfolded in multiple layers of conflict. Financial, psychological, investigative, and possibly something more. Each new discovery did not resolve one question, it created others. And as Daniel moved forward, a realization began to form, not yet entirely clear, but impossible to ignore. Perhaps the story hadn't ended in 1959. Perhaps it had never truly stopped. As Daniel Mercer's investigation progressed, new layers began to emerge, not as direct answers, but as parallel paths that intertwined unsettlingly with the main case. The house in Los Feliz ceased to be merely the center of an isolated event and began to function as a point of convergence for fragmented stories, each contributing to the increased complexity of what had happened and what still seemed to be happening. One of these subplots emerged when Daniel managed to locate a former colleague of Harold's, Dr. Stephen Halpin. Already elderly and visibly reluctant, Halpin agreed to talk on the condition that his name not initially be associated with the publication of any material. During the meeting, he revealed details that had never been included in the official reports. According to him, Harold had been exhibiting increasingly obsessive behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime. It wasn't just concern about his project, but an almost compulsive insistence on proving that he was being sabotaged. Halpin described episodes in which Harold claimed that his studies were being observed, that there was external interference in his experiments, and that unknown people had access to information that should have been confidential. At the time, these allegations were interpreted as clear signs of psychological distress. However, in light of Daniel's recent findings, these statements took on a new dimension, not as conclusive evidence, but as elements that could no longer be easily dismissed. Meanwhile, Daniel began investigating the buyer's history. The name registered in the documents was practically non-existent in other contexts. There were no relevant public records, no significant commercial activity, no identifiable social presence. It was as if the identity had been created solely to formalize ownership of the property. This absence of traces raised an uncomfortable question. Why would someone acquire a property with that history and then keep it completely untouched for decades? Meanwhile, another line of events was unfolding among the area's longtime residents. A neighbor, Margaret Collins, who had lived on the same street since the 1950s, began sharing more detailed accounts with Daniel. Unlike other witnesses, Margaret didn't speak in vague terms. She described patterns. According to her, there were specific times of the year when the house seemed more active. These weren't explicit phenomena, but subtle changes, lights that always appeared in the same room at similar times and disappeared without explanation. Margaret also mentioned something Daniel hadn't yet considered: deliveries. On more than one occasion over the decades, she claimed to have seen vehicles briefly stop in front of the house in the early morning hours. There was no visible movement of people entering or leaving, but the cars remained there for a few minutes before driving away. None of these occurrences had been officially recorded, making it impossible to objectively verify their veracity. Still, the consistency of the accounts added a new layer of unease. These subplots began to converge unexpectedly when Daniel found an old letter hidden among the house's documents. It was an unsent letter, written by Harold, addressed to a recipient identified only by initials. The content was fragmented, but revealing. There were direct mentions of broken agreements, missed deadlines, and a phrase that was repeated with variations: "They won't wait any longer." This discovery intensified the narrative pressure. If Harold was truly involved in something bigger than his medical projects, then the crime might not just be the result of an internal breakdown, but part of a broader sequence of events, possibly abruptly interrupted in that early morning of 1959. At the same time, Daniel began to realize that his own presence in the house seemed to influence the atmosphere. On one of his visits, while reviewing previously taken photographs, he noticed that a specific object, a small clock above the fireplace, showed different times in photos taken just minutes apart. Initially, he attributed this to technical glitches. But when he repeated the test on subsequent visits, the pattern remained. This perception wasn't enough to draw a conclusion, but it was enough to alter his relationship with the space. The house ceased to be merely a place for research and began to act as an element that reacted, albeit subtly, to human presence. As these discoveries accumulated, external pressure also increased. People interested in the case began contacting Daniel, offering information, some plausible, others clearly speculative. Among them was a man who claimed to have an indirect connection with the investors mentioned in Harold's documents. He did not provide concrete evidence, but his statements reinforced the idea that the medical project could have implications beyond the scientific field. These multiple narrative threads, Harold's behavior, the obscure identity of the owner, neighborhood accounts, physical evidence inside the house, and possible external connections, began to form a complex network where each element seemed to influence the other. None of these subplots, in isolation, offered a definitive answer. But together, they created a structure where the mystery became deeper and at the same time harder to ignore. The tension increased not only because of the lack of answers, but also because of the feeling that an invisible limit was being gradually crossed. Daniel was no longer just investigating the past. He was beginning, without fully realizing it, to insert himself into something that was still unfolding. And with each new discovery, a silent certainty solidified. The closer he got to the truth, the further away it seemed to become. Daniel Mercer's research reached a silent limit before he even realized it. There was no clear warning, no single event that marked the shift, but gradually everything began to align in a way that left no turning back. The subplots that once seemed parallel began to converge, forming a single, dense and unsettling structure. The turning point began to take shape the night Daniel decided to stay at the house longer than usual. Until then, his visits were brief, calculated, always guided by a specific objective. But that night, something was different. The notes, the accounts, and especially Harold's letter created a sense of urgency that he could no longer ignore. He entered the house shortly after midnight. The atmosphere seemed heavier than on previous visits. It wasn't just the stagnant air or the absolute silence, it was a subtle, almost imperceptible yet constant presence. As if the space were, somehow, watching over him. Daniel began to review the rooms again, now with a more meticulous eye. Each object, each detail, seemed to carry a potential meaning. It was then that he decided to return to Harold's office, the only room that still seemed partially unexplored. The office remained organized, but something stood out. A small, seemingly ordinary built-in wall cabinet had almost invisible marks around the frame. They weren't damage, but signs of frequent use. Daniel approached, and after a few minutes of inspection, found a discreet mechanism, a hidden compartment. Upon opening the cabinet, a deeper interior space than expected was revealed. Inside, there was a sealed metal box, showing signs of wear. There was no external identification, only the weight and the feeling that this object shouldn't be there, or perhaps shouldn't be found. Daniel hesitated for a few seconds, but curiosity got the better of him. Upon opening the box, he found a series of documents, recording tapes, and a hand-bound notebook. Unlike the fragmented notes he had found previously, this notebook seemed structured. It was a continuous record. The first few pages maintained the expected technical standard: calculations, diagrams, medical notes. But as it progressed, the content changed. The words became more direct, more urgent. Harold no longer wrote as a doctor, but as someone trying to record something that could not be said openly. There were clear references to encounters with unidentified individuals, descriptions of conversations where vague terms were used to avoid direct exposure, and a constant repetition of a central idea: control. Harold mentioned that his work had ceased to be just a medical project and had become part of something bigger, something he didn't fully understand. One of the most striking passages described a specific event that occurred weeks before the crime. Harold recounted that he had been instructed to halt certain lines of research and redirect his studies toward applications he considered ethically questionable. He resisted. And in his own words, it was at that moment that they stopped negotiating. Daniel continued reading, now with a growing sense of tension. The last pages of the notebook were different. The writing was more uneven, as if it had been done under pressure. Harold described a sequence of events that culminated in an alarming realization. He believed his family was being used as a form of coercion. This revelation completely altered the narrative. The crime, previously interpreted as an isolated act of a man in crisis, now appeared in a new light. If Harold truly believed his family was at risk, not due to his own instability, but to external forces, then his actions might have been motivated by something more complex, not justifiable, but perhaps situated within a context that had never been considered. Daniel stepped away from the notebook, trying to process the information. It was at that moment that he realized something even more disturbing, a sound, not coming from outside, but from inside the house, a faint, metallic noise, like the movement of a small object across a hard surface. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to completely break the silence. Daniel remained motionless for a few seconds, trying to identify the source. The sound repeated itself, now coming from a nearby room. He stood up slowly, leaving his notebook open on the table. Each step seemed amplified by the surrounding silence. As he left the office, the hallway was exactly as before, but the feeling was different, denser, more present. As he approached the main room, he noticed something that wasn't there when he entered. One of the Christmas presents, which had previously remained untouched on the table, was now on the floor. The packaging had been partially torn. Daniel stopped. There was no wind, no external movement, no immediate explanation for the change. He approached cautiously, observing the object. The torn paper revealed only a small part of its contents, something metallic, reflective. Before she could react, the sound returned, now closer. It was no longer just an isolated noise. It was a sequence, small movements like carefully restrained footsteps. Daniel turned around slowly. The hallway, which had previously been empty, now seemed darker, not because of the absence of light, but because of an altered sense of depth, as if the very structure of the space had subtly yet noticeably changed. And then for a brief moment he saw, not a complete figure, not something defined, but a movement, a presence that behaved neither as a shadow nor as a reflection, something that occupied space independently. Daniel instinctively recoiled, his heart racing, his mind trying to find a logical explanation that wouldn't come. The house, which until then had been an object of study, now presented itself as something active, something that responded. He quickly returned to the office, grabbed the notebook and the metal box. There was no more room for doubt. Whatever was happening there didn't belong only to the past. As he left the house, already outside, Daniel looked back one last time. A light came on in one of the upstairs windows. There was nobody inside, or at least there shouldn't be. At that moment, the turning point became irreversibly consolidated. The investigation ceased to be merely a search for historical answers and transformed into something immediate, present, and possibly dangerous. And for the first time since the beginning, Daniel considered a possibility he had previously avoided. Perhaps Harold wasn't just running away from something. Perhaps he was trying to stop it. Daniel's departure from the house that morning brought no relief, only a change in the nature of fear. Until then, everything he had faced could be organized into hypotheses, theories, and analyses. Even the strangest elements could still be pushed into the realm of doubt. But now, there was a rupture. Something had been seen, heard, recorded, not just as interpretation, but as direct experience. In the following hours, back in his apartment, Daniel tried to organize everything he had collected. He spread the documents out on the table, revisited Harold's notebook, and mentally reproduced every detail of the house. The logic was still there, fragmented, trying to hold itself together. The involvement with shady investors, the mounting pressure, the fear that his family was being used as an instrument of coercion. All of this formed a plausible narrative. But there was a new element, impossible to fit into that same model. The house was reacting. He began reviewing the recordings made during previous visits. Audios that, until then, seemed irrelevant began to be listened to with obsessive attention. In certain sections, noises that had previously been ignored emerged, small interferences, sounds that did not correspond to the expected environment. They were not clear enough to be identified, but they were present, constant, repetitive. The photographs also underwent further analysis. By comparing them side by side, Daniel realized that the variations in the objects were not random. There was a subtle pattern of displacement, almost as if certain items were moved within a specific limit. The clock on the mantelpiece, for example, appeared in slightly different positions in each image, always within a small range, as if obeying its own logic. These findings offered no answers, but intensified Daniel's internal conflict. He could no longer treat the house merely as a backdrop. There was a dynamic there, something that interacted, albeit indirectly. At the same time, the findings contained in Harold's notebook began to generate external repercussions. Daniel shared parts of the material with a trusted contact, a researcher specializing in the analysis of historical documents. The response came quickly, but fraught with caution. According to him, some of the descriptions made by Harold, especially those related to redirecting research and external pressure, were consistent with practices observed in confidential projects of the time, although there was no direct evidence linking the case to any specific institution. This partial validation brought new weight to the investigation. If there were, in fact, external interests involved, then the silence surrounding the case for decades might not have been accidental. It could have been maintained. A few days later, Daniel began to notice changes outside his home. They weren't explicit events, but small disruptions to his routine. A car parked for long periods in front of his building, phone calls without caller ID that ended as soon as they were answered, empty emails sent from non-existent addresses, nothing that could be proven individually, but which, together, created a constant feeling of being watched. He tried to remain objective, recording each occurrence and avoiding hasty conclusions, but the frequency of these events began to affect his behavior. What had once been an investigative focus became intertwined with personal caution. He revised routes, avoided predictable schedules, and limited the sharing of information. Meanwhile, the house in Los Feliz remained exactly as before, at least externally. No visible signs of change, no intervention. But reports from the neighborhood began to increase. Margaret Collins contacted them again, this time with a more urgent tone. She described a specific night when the house lights remained on for an unusual period, illuminating different rooms in sequence, as if someone were moving around inside. The police were called, but as on previous occasions, nothing was found. No forced entry, no identified presence, just the house, silent, intact. Daniel decided to return once more, this time with a different approach, not just to collect data, but to test a hypothesis that was beginning to take shape. If the house exhibited variations in response to human presence, then it would be possible to observe a clearer pattern under controlled conditions. He entered during the day, with more precise equipment, marking the positions of objects, recording temperatures, capturing continuous audio. For hours, nothing happened. The environment remained static, almost indifferent, but as the natural light diminished, something began to change. Not abruptly, but gradually. The temperature in certain rooms dropped inconsistently. The air became denser in specific parts of the house, and again the sounds returned, now more frequent, closer. They weren't loud, but they were organized, sequential. Daniel remained calm, recording everything. But upon reviewing the data in real time, he noticed something that completely altered the direction of his investigation. The patterns of variation, temperature, sound, movement of objects were not random. They were concentrated in specific areas of the house, forming a path, a route, and this route always led to the same point, Harold's office. This finding not only connected the physical elements of the house, but also reinforced the importance of what had been found there. The notebook, the metal box, the hidden records, everything seemed to be at the center of something bigger. When Daniel left the house that day, he was no longer carrying just information. He was carrying a preliminary conclusion that completely changed the scenario. Whatever was happening there was not scattered, it was focused, and that meant there was an intention. From that moment on, the consequences of the turning point ceased to be merely psychological or investigative. They became operational. Daniel was no longer just trying to understand what had happened. He was trying to understand what was still happening and why. From the moment Daniel understood that there was a pattern, not only in the events at home, but in the way everything seemed to converge on Harold's office, his posture ceased to be reactive and became strategic. The fear didn't disappear, but it was reorganized. He no longer tried to avoid it. He began to use it as an indicator, a tool to measure what he didn't yet fully understand. In the following days, Daniel drastically reduced any external exposure. He cut off unnecessary contacts, suspended open communications about the case, and began working in isolation, not out of impulsive paranoia, but as a calculated decision. If there were, in fact, hidden interests linked to the story, the less predictable he was, the less chance there would be of direct interference. He returned to the materials with a new focus. Instead of seeking broad answers, he began working with specific questions. He reread Harold's notebook several times, now paying attention not only to the content, but also to the structure. He realized that certain notes were not organized chronologically, but rather by association. Words and symbols were repeated on different pages, creating indirect connections between seemingly unconnected passages. This pattern led Daniel to identify something that had gone unnoticed. Harold wasn't just recording events. He was encoding information. The discovery completely changed the approach. Daniel began mapping these repetitions, cross-referencing terms, dates, and references. Over time, a second level of reading began to emerge, an internal organizational system that pointed to locations, times, and possibly instructions. Meanwhile, he decided to test a new hypothesis inside the house. If the environment reacted to human presence, perhaps it also reacted to intention, not just to the fact that someone was there, but to what that person was doing, to their focus, their directed action. On his next visit, Daniel took copies of the most relevant pages from the notebook with him. He positioned himself in the office, exactly where the patterns converged, and began to read specific passages aloud, following the order he had reconstructed from the coding. In the first few minutes, nothing happened. The silence remained absolute, almost oppressive. But gradually, signs began to emerge, not scattered as before, but concentrated. The air around the table grew colder. A faint metallic clang echoed from the wall where the hidden compartment had been found, and for the first time there was a direct response to what he was doing. Upon pronouncing a specific sequence of words, a combination of technical terms and dates, the sound ceased abruptly, as if something had recognized that pattern. Daniel stopped reading, observing his surroundings with heightened attention. There was no visible movement, but the feeling of presence was undeniable. No longer diffuse, but localized, focused. He repeated the process, now with slight variations. In some cases, nothing happened. In others, the same signals returned. Temperature variations, short sounds, almost imperceptible displacements. The behavior was not random, it was reactive. This finding marked a significant advance. For the first time, Daniel was not merely observing the phenomenon, he was interacting with it. Over subsequent visits, he refined this approach. He created specific reading sequences, tested different combinations, and meticulously recorded each response. Gradually, he began to identify a clearer pattern of interaction. Certain passages in the notebook acted as triggers, others as blockages. It was as if Harold had left an incomplete system, an attempt at communication that was never finalized. This realization brought a new dimension to Harold's role in the story. He wasn't just someone who had been pressured or manipulated. He had tried to react. He had tried to record something in a way that could be understood later, perhaps by someone willing to look beyond the surface. At the same time, Daniel began to notice changes in himself. His way of thinking became more precise, more focused. He abandoned broad interpretations and began to work with measurable structures, patterns, and responses. The fear, which had previously been diffuse, now had defined contours. And this, paradoxically, made him more controllable. But this evolution also came at a cost. Prolonged isolation, the intensity of the investigation, and the nature of what was being discovered began to affect his perception outside the house. Common sounds seemed out of place. Small variations in the urban environment drew his attention disproportionately. He became more sensitive to patterns, even where they might not exist. Still, he remained focused. In one of his final analyses, while completely reorganizing the notebook's contents, Daniel identified a final sequence, a set of pages that, when read in the correct order, formed something different. It wasn't just a record, it was an instruction, and that instruction pointed to a specific moment, a date, a schedule. And it was a condition that had not yet been fully understood. This discovery redefined the next step. It was no longer about exploring possibilities. It was about executing something that Harold had left unfinished. Daniel then understood that his journey up to that point had not been merely investigative. It had been preparatory. He was no longer just trying to understand what had happened in that house. He was being led piece by piece until the moment when he would have to decide what to do with it all. And for the first time, the central question ceased to be what happened and became another, much more direct one. What else could happen? The final sequence identified by Daniel left no room for broad interpretations. It was direct, structured, and above all, specific. Unlike previous notes, which required analysis and reconstruction, this set of instructions seemed to have been designed for execution. Harold wasn't just recording, he was preparing someone. The date indicated in the notebook was fast approaching. It wasn't a long interval, which reinforced the idea that everything had been planned within a defined time frame. The time, in turn, coincided with the same period in which reports of activity in the house were most frequent, between midnight and the early hours of the morning. Daniel began to meticulously organize every detail. There was no room for improvisation. He reviewed all the recordings, reanalyzed the house's reaction patterns, redid the tests in the office, adjusting small variables to ensure he understood exactly how the environment behaved. Every action now had a clear purpose: to minimize the unknown as much as possible. At the same time, he made an important decision: to close all pending subplots. He contacted Margaret Collins one last time, not to gather new accounts, but to instruct her to completely distance herself from the house in the following days. The tone of his speech was direct, without detailed explanations, but sufficient to convey the seriousness of the situation. Margaret, though confused, agreed. There was something in the way Daniel spoke that left no room for questioning. Regarding the researcher who had analyzed the documents, Daniel chose not to share the most recent findings, not out of distrust, but out of understanding. What was about to happen could not be shared. Not yet. It was something that demanded absolute control and possibly individual responsibility. In the days leading up to the appointed date, Daniel noticed that the activity around the house had changed. It was no longer sporadic reports. There was a greater frequency, albeit subtle. Lights that appeared at shorter intervals, sounds that seemed to occur even during the day, although less intense. The pattern wasn't just repeating itself, it was intensifying. This progression reinforced a hypothesis that was beginning to solidify. The event described by Harold was not just something that could happen, it was something that was underway. And the date recorded in the notebook might not be the beginning, but the culmination point. The day before, Daniel made his final entrance into the house before the final execution. The atmosphere was different, not in its structure, but in how it reacted to his presence. The silence was no longer absolute. There was a kind of implicit expectation, as if the space were in a state of anticipation. He returned to his office, organized the documents in the exact order indicated by the notebook, and mentally reviewed each step. The final instruction involved a sequence of coordinated actions, reading specific passages, placing objects in designated locations, and, most importantly, maintaining a continuous pattern without interruptions. Any deviation could compromise the process. Before leaving, Daniel performed one last test. He reproduced part of the sequence and observed the house's response. The signals came faster than before. The air cooled abruptly. A more intense sound echoed through the walls, as if something were being displaced in an invisible internal space. And for a brief moment, he had the clear feeling that he was not alone in the room. But this time, he did not back down. The reaction was recorded, analyzed, and most importantly, understood as part of the process. The fear still existed, but it no longer determined his actions. He had moved beyond that stage. As he left the house that night, Daniel didn't look back. Not out of disinterest, but by choice. Everything I needed to observe had already been seen. Everything that needed to be understood, at least partially, had already been processed. Now all that remained was to execute. On the appointed night, he would return. Without support, no guarantees. The preparation was complete, but there was one element that no analysis could eliminate: the uncertainty about exactly what would be triggered at the end of the sequence. And yet, there was a growing clarity in his mind. If Harold had left those instructions, it wasn't just to reveal something, it was to prevent it. The climax would not simply be the resolution of a mystery, it would be a direct confrontation with that which had remained hidden for decades, waiting, reacting, and now, finally, about to manifest itself fully. Night fell without any extraordinary signs outside. The street remained silent, as on so many other dawns throughout the decades. No unusual movement, no visible presence. But for Daniel, everything was already different even before crossing the gate of the house. He arrived exactly at the indicated time. The door gave way with the same slight resistance as always, but the air inside was denser than on any previous visit. It wasn't just a feeling, it was physical. Breathing required more effort, as if the environment was saturated with something invisible, accumulated over time. Daniel wasted no time. He walked straight to the office, carrying the documents organized in the exact sequence. Upon entering the room, he realized that something had already begun. The clock above the mantelpiece, which had previously displayed subtle variations, now moved continuously. The hands advanced at irregular intervals, speeding up and slowing down without any apparent pattern. The mechanical sound of the movement echoed through the room, breaking the silence insistently. He placed the papers on the table. The sequence has begun. The first reading was done in a low but firm voice. The words, previously fragmented, now followed a precise order. Each term seemed to fit into the next, with a logic that only made sense at that moment. There was no room for hesitation. In the first few minutes, the house responded in a controlled manner. The temperature dropped, as it had before. Small noises emerged from the walls, like internal movements. But as Daniel progressed through the sequence, the intensity increased. The air became unstable. The lights, which were non-existent, began to appear in specific points of the room. Brief reflections, as if light sources were activated for fractions of a second in invisible locations. The shadows began to behave independently, projecting shapes that did not correspond to any object present. Daniel continued. The second part of the sequence required physical action. He stood up, positioned the objects as indicated, the clock, a set of documents, the open metal box, all aligned at specific points in the room. Each movement was calculated, reproduced with precision. As soon as this step was completed, the environment reacted immediately. A deep sound coursed through the house's structure, as if something were being activated on an inner level, beyond the visible walls. The floor vibrated slightly beneath their feet. It wasn't destruction, it was movement. And then the demonstration came. In the hallway beyond the office door, a shape began to take shape. It wasn't a complete human figure, but it wasn't an ordinary shadow either. There was density. There was presence. Something actively occupied that space, responding directly to what was being done. Daniel felt the urge to stop, but it didn't stop. The final part of the sequence was the most important and the most risky. The final words, according to Harold's notebook, had to be spoken without interruption. Any mistake could compromise the entire process. He started. The voice, now firmer, echoed through the room, which was no longer behaving in a stable manner. The air vibrated with each word. The figure in the hallway advanced slowly, crossing the threshold of the door. There was no face, but there was direction. A clear movement towards the center of the room. The temperature dropped drastically. Daniel's breath became visible, condensing in the cold air. His eyes remained fixed on the documents, but the presence before him was impossible to ignore. With each word, the form seemed to react, not retreating, but intensifying. When Daniel uttered the second-to-last line, something changed. The shape halted the advance. For a moment, everything stood still, and then came the revelation. Not as an external voice, but as an overlay of perceptions. Fragments of images, sensations, information that were not properly seen but understood. Daniel had access to something that was not in the documents, something that Harold never managed to fully record. The project wasn't just medical. It involved experiments with states of consciousness, perception, and interaction with layers that were not fully understood at the time. The investors weren't seeking a cure. They were seeking control. Harold had discovered too late that he was opening something that couldn't be easily closed. The house was not just a setting, it was an anchor point. And the event of that night in 1959 was not just a collapse. It was a desperate attempt to halt a process that had already begun. The final word in the sequence had not yet been spoken. Daniel understood, at that moment, what he needed to do. If he completed the sequence, he would close the cycle started by Harold. But he would also release all the energy accumulated at that anchor point. There was no guarantee of containment. There was no guarantee of survival. If it stopped, the process would continue, slowly, silently, but inevitably. The choice wasn't between right and wrong. It was a matter of control versus consequence. The shape in front of him began to move again, closer, more defined. Daniel took a deep breath, and he uttered the last word. The effect was immediate. A silent impact swept through the room, like a sudden compression of space. The shape in the center of the room distorted, not disappearing, but being pulled inward, as if being collapsed by an internal force. The air became almost unbreathable. The walls vibrated. The objects on the table were thrown to the floor, but not chaotically. There was direction, convergence, everything being drawn to a single point, the space where the form had been. Daniel remained standing, resisting. The process lasted seconds or minutes. It was impossible to measure, and then it ended. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was empty. Daniel fell to his knees, trying to catch his breath. The environment was still again. No sounds, no changes, no perceptible presence. He stood up slowly, looking around. The clock above the fireplace had stopped. Exactly at the time it all began. The house, for the first time since 1959, did not react. The climax didn't provide a simple answer, but it brought something definitive. The cycle had been interrupted, and whatever was anchored there was no longer there. In the days that followed that night, the house in Los Feliz remained exactly as Daniel had left it, at least on the surface. No unusual movement was recorded, no lights were turned on again, no sounds were heard by the neighbors. For the first time in decades, the silence seemed to hide nothing. Daniel didn't return immediately. The impact of what had happened wasn't just physical, but structural. His body reacted slowly, as if it were still adjusting to the absence of something that, until then, had been part of his constant perception. The exhaustion didn't just come from the night of the climax, but from the entire process that had led him there. He spent days reviewing the final recordings. The footage captured during the sequence showed intense distortions at the most critical moments, interferences that made it impossible to recover the complete audio. The images, in turn, showed abrupt variations in light and shadow, but no defined shape. The event had happened, but it could not be reproduced objectively. Nevertheless, there was sufficient evidence for a practical conclusion. The standards had ceased. No temperature variations, without moving objects, no noise. The house had stopped reacting. This observation was indirectly confirmed by neighborhood accounts. Margaret Collins, in a later contact, described something simple but significant. Now it just looks like a house. There was no longer the feeling of discomfort when walking on the sidewalk. There was no longer that invisible weight that for years was part of the environment. Daniel decided to return one last time during the day. No rush, no equipment. The entrance was silent as always, but the difference was immediate. The air, once dense, was now ordinary. The atmosphere offered no resistance. Each room seemed simply what it was, an abandoned space marked by time, but free of any implicit tension. In the office, the focal point of the entire investigation, everything remained exactly as it had been left after the climax. Objects were scattered across the floor, the result of the final impact. The clock above the mantelpiece remained stopped, its hands fixed on the same time. Daniel approached. He looked at the clock for a few seconds, and without hesitation, he put it back in its original position. There was no reaction, no sound, no changes. The house remained still. He then picked up Harold's notebook, now no longer as a tool, but as a closed record. The pages, which had once held instructions, now seemed like mere words. The system Harold had created had served its purpose. There was nothing left to decipher. Before leaving, Daniel walked through all the rooms one last time. The living room, with the gifts still scattered around. The kitchen, with objects untouched since 1959. The bedrooms, silent, preserved in a state that no longer caused discomfort, only distance. As he walked through the exit door, he paused for a brief moment. Not to look back, but to acknowledge what had been concluded. The house in Los Feliz was no longer a breaking point. It was just a place. Over time, the property was finally put up for sale, without resistance, without obstacles. The process, which for decades seemed impossible, occurred simply. New owners took over the space, beginning renovations that, little by little, erased the visible traces of the past. The walls were painted, the furniture has been removed, discarded items. The structure remained, but the content changed. To those passing by on the street, there was no longer any indication that anything unusual had happened there. The house had blended into the rest of the neighborhood, becoming part of the normal flow of the city. Daniel, for his part, did not publish his investigation. The records were organized, filed, and kept out of circulation, not out of fear, but out of understanding. What had been resolved didn't need to be reopened, not in the same way. He continued his life with a silent but permanent change. His way of observing the world had adjusted, not because of the constant presence of the unknown, but because of the awareness that not everything needs to be exposed to be understood. The story of the Los Feliz house remained for the public, as it always was. An old case marked by a tragic event and shrouded in speculation. But for Daniel, there was a key difference. He knew the cycle had been interrupted, and that, behind the silence that now filled that space, there was nothing else waiting. Years later, passing through Los Feliz again, Daniel slowed down almost without realizing it. The house was still there, but it wasn't the same anymore. Renovated, inhabited, integrated into the everyday routine of the street. There was no longer any visible trace of what had once happened there. No strange sensations, no heavy silence, just life going on as it pleases. He didn't stop. There was no reason to, but as we moved forward, one idea remained, simple and unsettling. Some stories don't end when they are forgotten. They end when they finally cease to exist. And now I want to know from you, how far would you go to uncover the truth? Do you believe that everything that happened in that house can be explained solely by the human mind, or is there something we still can't fully understand? If this story captivated you, made you think, or even caused you discomfort that's hard to explain, leave a comment. Your opinion may open up new interpretations of what really happened. And if you enjoy true, mysterious, and disturbing stories like this one, follow along so you don't miss the upcoming accounts. Because sometimes what seems closed may just be waiting to be discovered by someone willing to go all the way.